2017 will go down in history as the year of the Switch, and while Wii U has been officially dead for quite some time and Nintendo is focusing on its newest platform, it still has some plans for the handheld 3DS, which in 2018 will see some new releases just in time for the system's 7th birthday, which is quite an impressive age for a system nowadays. Throughout the years, the Japanese company has accustomed us to the fact that what their systems lack in specs, they make up for with some unique technology, which is supposed to make their systems stand out and offer one-of-a-kind experiences. However, that's not always the case. While 3D was supposed to be the defining feature of the 3DS system, it wasn't as revolutionary as it was supposed to be, and the Japanese behemoth backed away from it after some time. As of now, the 3DS will be remembered for anything but the 3D, so let's take a closer look at the last true handheld. To avoid any leaks, Nintendo quietly announced the system at a meeting behind closed doors in early 2010, and later that year, officially at E3. The dual-screen system offering stereoscopic 3D hit store shelves soon after, in February in Japan and in March in Europe and the US. In the early days of the system, its marketing was almost entirely focused on the 3D feature, partially because in the era of James Cameron's Avatar, it was the hottest new technology, but mostly to help us ignore one of the worst launch titles in the console's history. Here, probably the only title worth mentioning was the 3D enhanced re-release of Rayman 2, a game which most of us have already completed back when we were kids. So, to sum up, the 3DS was a system for $250, on which the most interesting game was a 12-year-old platformer. It didn't look too good now, did it? At first, the 3DS was selling really bad, enough so that the American branch of Nintendo quickly announced a price drop to $170. And for those that felt cheated by a nearly 30% drop in the price, after almost half a year, Nintendo offered the so-called Ambassador Program, a bundle of free NES and Game Boy Advance games to be downloaded from the store. Despite the fact that the handheld had it tough due to the rising mobile market, the recently released 3DS also had to face Sony's PlayStation Vita that launched in spring of 2012. And since the competition was tough and the game library was disappointing, the early months of the 3DS life weren't easy, but the system eventually started to make up for lost time in 2013 when it became the best-selling system in North America. Games like The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds, Fire Emblem Awakening, Luigi's Mansion 2, Pokémon X and Y, and the newest Phoenix Wright and Professor Layton seemed to be enough to steal the gamer's attention away from a lackluster launch of next-gen systems, which wasn't that hard to be honest. Still, almost all of the games that made the new handheld a compelling purchase were mostly new releases in pre-existing franchises that, in most cases, only raised the bar in terms of graphics. The system didn't have any revolutionary new IP that utilized the 3D element in an interesting way. Is that because of the mediocre specs? Well, let's look inside the system. Here we have the first 3DS model. The button layout is similar to that of the DS. On the left we have the so-called circle pad, 3.5 and 3-inch screens with a resolution of 800 on 240 and 320 on 240 pixels respectively, and under them a 268 MHz processor and 128 MB of RAM. And just at the first glance you can see how much the new DS was behind the Vita. The new handheld from Sony also had a touchscreen, was twice as fast, had a bigger screen, and offered not one but two analog sticks, just like a home console. The 3DS later tried to make up for the last one with an extension called Circle Pad Pro, but this particular device was neither comfortable nor popular enough to use it in more games, and so it was quickly forgotten. As often is the case with Nintendo, interesting features were supposed to make up for weaker insides of the console. The bigger screen offered stereoscopic 3D, cameras to make 3D pictures, a Street Pass function that interacted with other people, access to a virtual console where we could buy digital releases, and a front camera if we wanted to take selfies in shitty quality. If, however, you didn't want to use your 3DS to increase your Instagram followers, the poor camera was also supposed to be used in the so-called AR, augmented reality, but that particular technology was later never used in any interesting games, apart from a few rather uninteresting experiments. All in all, the 3D feature in the 3DS was quite interesting at first, but in the long run, the games never really benefited from it, and the fact that it was draining the battery life faster made us forget about it altogether. Thanks to that, what was intended to be a revolutionary feature was in the end an unnecessary gimmick. It's not like the system was a complete failure though, it's much more complicated than that. But first, let's get one thing out of the way. Nintendo sometimes makes bad business decisions and seems to be out of touch with reality. Sometimes. However, one has to admit that the company changed for the better and tried to be much more responsive to its consumers while led by Satoru Iwata, and the evolution of the design of the 3DS is a good example of that. In 2012, we saw the release of a much bigger 3DS XL, later in 2013 a cheaper 2DS with no 3D, in 2014 a stronger new 3DS which was able to run certain exclusive games, and finally in 2017 we got the new 2DS XL, the definitive version of the system with a bigger screen, longer battery life, all of the new 3DS features, and most importantly, without 3D. Nintendo sold around 69 million copies of the system for a reason. In the 7 years the new DS has been on the market, the system was constantly being upgraded and improved, and eventually lost the unnecessary 3D and focused on what the gamers cared about the most: the games. The 3DS will go down in history not as a system that popularized its titular feature, but rather a system that gave us well-received and fun sequels to beloved Nintendo IPs. The new Mario, Pokemon or Fire Emblem weren't by any means revolutionary, they offered more of the same, but with better graphics, and it seems as if the fans wanted just that, which is quite sad considering that in the era of the first DS, almost every game on the system came up with an interesting and fun way to control it or interact with it. However, that was way back in the days when touchscreens seemed like something from a far future. New technology is always something we get excited about easily, but in the end, we buy games to get good gameplay and memorable experiences. And without those, every gimmick soon becomes a fading trend. That was the case with 3D and motion controls, and that probably will be the case with VR. The 3DS sold pretty well, all things considered, but compared to 150 million copies of the first DS, the second best-selling console of all time, it's obvious Nintendo felt somewhat disappointed. While writing this video, I was under the impression that next to the rise of the mobile market, it was also the lack of new original IPs that hurt the handheld's overall sales, but that's not completely true. If you look at the best-selling games on both the DS and the 3DS, they look very familiar, dominated by Pokemon and Mario, with minor differences like the DS having some new IPs and the 3DS having more re-releases. So if the fans wanted the same thing and got exactly what they wanted, why did the 3DS sold so much worse than the DS? Well, that's because of the decreasing customer base and the fact that handhelds don't have this wow factor they used to. Sure, Pokemon fans instinctively went to buy X and Y on day one, and Pokemon continued to sell really well, but with every single generation, the overall sales decrease. And the state of the Pokemon series seems to perfectly sum up the fate of the 3DS. It sold well amongst hardcore fans, but didn't offer enough new experiences to interest a bigger audience. Of course, there's also the rise of the mobile market to take into account and the recent shift in trends. We use devices like smartphones and tablets every day, and those quickly caught up to the 3DS and made the system obsolete in the eyes of a casual gamer. Why do I have to buy a separate device that only plays games when I can get often better looking games on a phone that I use every day? While back in the day, when a color screen on an ugly cell phone was a thing of luxury, a console with a touchscreen and robust games for dozens of hours were much more compelling. Taking all those factors into consideration, it's still hard to believe why the successor of the best-selling handheld in history wasn't as successful as it could have been. Despite trends and popular gameplay formulas, even a mediocre game on a Nintendo system is often way better than a random game from the App Store. In the end, it seems as if it all boils down to Nintendo's choices and the quality of the handheld itself. 3DS was just poor on a technological level and wasn't multifunctional enough. Maybe if Nintendo invested in good specs instead of the gimmicky 3D they tried to make us forget about, the handheld would have done much more better in the fight with the rising mobile market. That question can be answered by looking at the disappointing fate of the Vita, but that system, however, never had such legendary series like Mario, Zelda or Pokemon. To sum up, the 3D in the 3DS was simply a bad move. Nintendo gambled and didn't win because they put their money on the wrong horse. But that couldn't have been foreseen, and it's quite understandable looking back at it from a broader perspective. Every time a unique and original technology debuts, everyone wants to outrun the competition and invest in the current technology of tomorrow that will someday become a standard in gaming. Sadly though, the 3D didn't become that standard. Nintendo 3DS was a good system, but it wasn't as revolutionary as its predecessor and overall wasn't as successful as it could have been. Let's just hope that the hybrid Nintendo Switch system will gracefully continue its predecessor's legacy.